This is Stephanie Stock, president of Ohio Advocates for Medical Freedom, and advocate for conservative policy and the protection of our constitutional liberties. Welcome to Stephanie Stock Straight Up. Today, we are welcoming industrial hygienist and nationally known chemical expert Stephen Petty. Stephen testified at the Data Center Study Commission hearing yesterday. He's here to discuss the chemicals used in data center cooling systems and how those would need to be managed to ensure that our water remains safe when data centers discharge water. I'm going to go ahead and let Stephen go over his incredible credentials because the list is too long and he'll be better at describing it than I will. Thank you so much for coming on today, Stephen. We really appreciate you. A lot of people in Ohio have a lot of concerns, so this is a great thing for us to be discussing today.
Thank you for having me. Just a real quick summary of my background. I have undergraduate and graduate degrees in chemical engineering with honors, and then an MBA, first in my class. I served as a senior research scientist at Battelle and Columbia Gas, each for 10 years. And then I have had my own corporation for 30 years. So I've been practicing over almost 50 years. I'm a certified industrial hygienist, which is a fancy word for health and safety expert. Requires 2 8-hour exams and a lot of experience. I'm a professional engineer in 6 states, including Ohio. Certified safety professional, which is sort of an OSHA expert. I've also served as an adjunct professor teaching environmental and geology classes, and I have 9 U.S. patents. Real quickly, based on 10,000 actual projects, I wrote the textbook for the insurance industry twice, in 2013 and again in 2023. It's endorsed by the International Codes Council, which is kind of a nice thing. One of the things I've been doing the last 20 years or 25 years is, and it's because I'm old, I guess, but as you get older, you get called in by lawyers to testify on cases. And I've been an expert witness on almost 400 cases. Most of them are related to exposure control, warnings, and the adequacy of those warnings, and then the standard of care. Did people behave like they should have? I've actually been involved in almost 70 now Roundup cases. I've been involved in 4 very large PFAS, or the forever chemical cases. I've been involved in the East Palestine Railroad case, and then hundreds of other cases on different chemicals. Was even selected to do the Blue Jackets locker room when they were getting sick, to try to figure out why they were getting sick. I've sampled twice for anthrax, and also sampled for biotoxins, mold, bacteria, etc. So with that, I'll turn it back to you to start to ask you some questions about data centers.
Sure, thank you so much. So yesterday in committee, there was clearly a difference in what the committee members thought a closed loop system was, and how a quote unquote closed loop system actually works. It's a little bit complicated. There's multiple loops. I think we can start out by you just describing the systems, both in the data centers and also in, they want them to be energy, independent, which is important. We don't want them tapping into our grid and having brownouts and everything, right? So we do want them to have their own power. So that means that's going to require them to have like a gas power plant, attached. So can you explain both the systems that are required, because there's cooling systems required for both, and maybe express get some of the intricacies of those related to the people, so they can understand it, because it's complicated.
So I'll take the easiest one first. So the electric plant is, as part of the process, you have to take water from the process and cool it down to then run it back through the cycle. And traditionally, this is done by discharging it through a cooling tower. In other words, the plant water is basically in a semi-closed loop, and then you just take other water and you spray it on top of these coils, and they call that evaporative cooling. So what happens is the water that they pull into the cooling towers is sprayed down over these pipes, and as it hits the pipes and evaporates, it takes heat from those pipes, and so that's called an evaporative cooling process. So when they say closed loop, open loop, even in the power plant, the liquid that goes circling around through the power plant is semi-closed. They're not absolutely closed because these loops contain corrosion inhibitors and sometimes biocides, and they also pick up metals, they pick up solids, and from time to time those consumables, those corrosion inhibitors, have to be replaced. And like any other, like say your car with antifreeze, from time to time you've got to dump that all out and start anew. So you have some maintenance to maintain the chemicals, and every so often you have to clean out the whole system. The reason they talk about it being an open loop is the fact that the part that's cooling it, the cooling tower, is taking water from a source and it's pumping it to the top of the cooling tower and spraying it in the air. As those droplets come down, they contact the piping, the heat exchangers from this loop, this closed loop, and they what happens is those droplets evaporate, and in the process of evaporating, they suck the heat out of this warm water and turn it colder. And so, but the real loss there is on that water that you put to the top of the tower and spray it. 70 to 80% of that water is lost. So even in this situation, you really have a closed loop that's not always closed, because from time to time you got to do maintenance and replenish those chemicals and then replace them. But there's a lot of confusion as to what's closed and what's not closed. Typically, these loops that go through the plants, whether it be the chip plant or this, are semi-closed, but they get open from time to time for maintenance and replacement. But the other side of the loop is certainly open here, because what's happening from the pipe that brings the water and sprays it into the top of the tower and lets it fall on these things, that's obviously open because it's open to the atmosphere. Now, when you go over to the cooling chip side, you have a similar process in many respects. You have a semi-closed loop that takes heat out of the data center, the chips, etc., that use electricity in the process of humming along. They give up some of that energy. And so the liquid that comes in cool is warmed up and it's sent out, and it can either be cooled with a chiller, a conventional refrigeration system, or it can exchange with a cooling tower, not unlike what we've talked before about, where liquid is taken from the cooling tower that's cooled, it picks up the heat, and then it dumps it back into the top of the cooling tower. Now it can get this liquid here, if it's an open system, it's just taking water from the bottom and spraying it out the top. And what happens is that hot water is cooled by by air coming in and evaporating a large portion of that water, and what's left is cooler when it hits the bottom. Of course, you have a constant replenishment requirement there, because about 70 to 80% of that water is lost through evaporation. Now, you can also do this loop closed and then add basically an air-to-air heat exchanger, which is basically, instead of just letting this liquid open to the atmosphere, you keep it in a closed loop, and then you basically run a blower or a fan over it to take the heat out of it and discharge it to the air. But when this system is any of these so-called closed loops, whether it be this one on the primary one on the power plant, or you could have a third one that's closed, they're really semi-closed because you're constantly having to add chemicals, corrosion inhibitors, so the metal doesn't get chewed up as fast. And then, and also they also absorb various materials despite the corrosion inhibitors, so they get sort of more viscous. There's what they call total dissolved solids. And so from time to time, you've got to add more corrosion inhibitor, open up the system and do that. And then you also, from time to time, have to just replace it, because it just gets, just like your car, every so often you got to replace your antifreeze. It just gets gunked up. So it's a little bit of a long discussion about that, but the bottom line is that in the process of going through this, you consume, if the cycles are open in terms of getting rid of the heat, you're consuming a lot of water. and if they're the closed portions, whether they be all or a portion of the loops, they use and they use a lot of chemicals, some of which are things like glycols, which are antifreeze. They use obviously corrosion inhibitors, phosphates, and molybdates, and then they also exchange with components, whether they be refrigerants or Teflon related components that have traces or small amounts of what we call forever chemicals or PFASs. And the problem with the PFASs is that they have to be cleaned up to very, very low levels, like 4 to 10 parts per trillion, which is like a million times lower in concentration than we typically see in parts per million. So the problem is, even though they're relatively low in concentration, they have to be cleaned up to very low concentrations, a million times lower than what normally people expect to
So
see.
so just to be clear, they'll use words like, well, there's just not very much. It's just trace amounts. Well, trace amounts of forever chemicals. If you have a trace amount of something that lasts forever versus a trace amount of something that goes away in a few days, those things maybe not a big deal. But when you have a buildup over time of trace amounts of things that never go away over and over and over and over again, eventually it's not trace anymore. Does that describe it pretty well?
Well, trace is a term used usually by people that want to, it's a psychological term almost, because I've been involved in dozens of cases and in many trials, over 20 trials. Four cases where I was involved in four major PFAS cases. Um, and I was in at least four trials. And that term trace is to sort of imply to the person that's hearing the words that it's de minimis or it's small, it's not a problem.
Mhm.
Um, and the difficulty here with PFAS is twofold. One, they they provide health hazards down to parts per trillion in terms of drinking water standards. And
Mhm.
again, this is people are used to parts per million. A part per trillion is a million times lower. So you might say, well, a trace chemical would be a part per million. Well, a part a part per million in terms of PFAS is like a million parts per trillion. So, um, so what one person I always like to say, what one person might say is small, another person might say is gigantic. And the other problem with PFAS is that once they get out, they live. The best way we can describe it is the half life. That is, if you had most materials will degrade with time. So the half life is how long will it take for half of it to go bye bye. So if you have 100 pounds for PFAS, like PFOA, which is one of the ones that we still called C8, the half life of that chemical is about 1 million years. So 100 pounds will be 50 pounds in a million years. It'll be 25 pounds in 2 million years. It'll be 12.5 pounds in 3 million years, 6.25 pounds in 4 million years, and a little over 3 pounds in 5 million years. So even if you went from 100 to 3, it takes 5 million years to do that. So effectively, that's why they're called forever chemicals, because in terms of numbers of human lifetimes, it's, I can't even calculate the number, but it's it's like,
The water's going to affect generations of children if it's not managed properly.
I
This is
mean, hundreds of thousands of generations.
right, right. So in the hearing, we had we had Senator Chavez try to I said mansplain to you uh, how did that somehow the surfactants of PFAS are just no different than soap. So maybe you might want to just briefly touch on that sort of fallacy that he put in front of the committee to sort of downplay these concerns, which are relevant concerns about risk long term with our water. Just briefly touch on that, and then maybe we can go into the fact that these chemicals currently are not being regulated by municipalities, or the EPA is not regulating them through municipalities currently, but that is coming down the pipeline. And so, if we don't, of course, regulate these data centers now, they're going to be building up over the years, and then we're going to be paying that bill later. So maybe just speak to the soap reference, and then speak to what's coming with PFAS regulations in the future versus how we have none at the moment.
Yeah, the my understanding is that Senator Chavez has a degree in chemical engineering, as do I. So when he compared PFAS to soap, I found it to either he was disingenuous or he was ignorant. And the reason I say that is that particular argument was used in many trials in the C8 cases where I was on the stand for 12 days. Well, it's a surfactant. It's just like soap. It's like shampoo. And that's the only analogy I can think of is it's kind of like saying that salt and arsenic are both minerals, and so they're the same. And just because they're in this case they're both surfactants, there's tremendous differences in the chemistry. There's tremendous differences in the half-lives. There's tremendous differences in the toxicology. And then there's tremendous differences in the epidemiology, how it affects people in terms of disease. And so for him to use, to me, that was a behavioral, because I have an emphasis in behavioral psychology in my MBA. This was a classic case of trying to paper over what is something that is very problematic by comparing it to something that isn't, because they're both technically under a huge broad category of substances. And I just don't believe as a chemical engineer that he wouldn't know the differences. So I find it to be very disingenuous. And I reacted strongly because I've seen that argument used in trial, and I've refuted that argument in trials, big time trials. And I just found it to in that audience to use that sort of language really was a disservice to the community, to use that sort of language and sort of diminish the serious repercussions of PFAS versus soap. I just think that was unfortunate, and I have to believe that I'm just surprised that he didn't do his homework on me, and to try to pull that sort of argument to me in a public forum was kind of shameful, actually.
Yeah, I don't think it was very well received by the public either. These hearings were supposed to be listening to the citizens' concerns, and the goal of this committee was to quote unquote study, not to debunk people who are experts in the field who are coming in with legitimate concerns. And I will state for the record, since you didn't get a chance yesterday, Stephen is a Republican. Fancy that. There are Republicans that care about the environment. I am one of them. So, and I don't know if some of that approach that he had was maybe because he was viewing you as some sort of environmentalist that was coming in to, obstruct business or something. I don't know. But I did want to just clarify that for people that, Stephen is, he's a Republican. So it would have been much nicer if the committee had utilized your expertise to actually pick your brain rather than cross-examine you, which is kind of what it looked like yesterday. So
Yeah,
anyway, so
I'd like to add to that. Yeah, I'm one of the few, actually, I would say, right of center people in toxic tort, but I'm asked by the other side, how can you work for us? And I always say that at some level there's right and wrong, and it doesn't matter what your politics are.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and I'm generally well received by juries as a consequence of that. But it was unfortunate if he had done his homework and realized how many what my background is and how many cases I've been involved in and the depth of my knowledge and background. He could instead have picked my brain to ask meaningful questions to get answers to solutions or potential solutions as opposed to being adversarial. And it was
Yep.
clear that he was adversarial. Um, and that was unfortunate because he wasted a really good opportunity because I only had 10 minutes.
Yep. Agreed. Well, I hope that a lot of the legislators and hopefully a lot of the committee members, because there were many that were receptive, maybe will tune into this and get a deeper view than what they were able to get yesterday because of time constraints and because we didn't have the ability to have the visual aids. So I know I will be passing this around to House and Senate members, and hopefully they will view this also. Okay, so going into that second part, do you want to go into the types of chemicals and the fact that the PFAS isn't currently being regulated through the EPA?
Yeah, let me just summarize it by I use PFAS only to illustrate some issues with respect to timing and the impacts on municipalities versus where does the burden fall and should it fall on the public versus the private. But EPA can only regulate those chemicals that are regulated. Sounds sort of simple. And so when EPA gets up, whether it be Ohio or federal, and they say, well, we'll have a permit to install and a permit to operate, and they'll have to follow state and federal laws. Well, those laws only apply to regulated chemicals.
Hmm.
And the 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 little the point that is missed by many who don't understand the details are that for those chemicals that aren't regulated, they just simply end up either in ultimately they end up in the public water supply. And in this case, the chemicals would be that are not regulated, as far as I know, in the water side are some of the corrosion inhibitors, the phosphates, some liquidates, the biocides, and the PFAS to the extent that it's present. And the reason that I use PFAS as an example is that there is a regulation coming in PFAS. It's in 2029 where municipalities have to clean the PFAS levels up in the drinking water supply to somewhere between 4 and 10 parts per trillion, depending on which PFAS they find. Because PFAS is a group of chemicals. They're fluorinated hydrocarbons. And the more toxic ones you got to clean down to 4, and the less toxic ones to 10 parts per trillion. So this has to start in 2029. Now there's some language that says if they request a waiver, they can extend that to 2031. But sometime in that time frame, they're going to have to take PFAS out of the water supply down to those levels for drinking water. The problem is if you have these data centers who aren't even monitoring for PFAS, because they're not going to monitor for things that aren't regulated
Right.
necessarily, and unless there's some forcing function, um, and so they're going to continue to discharge to the extent that is present PFAS into the wastewater or the local waters, and eventually those waters end up, at least in part, being part of the public water supply in general. And so you're adding the burden, if you will, down. So if these things operate, say from 2027 to 2029 or 2031, they're imparting more of a load to the water treatment facility than they otherwise would have.
Right.
And that burden is now going to be taken by the public water supply municipality. And I had the fortune or unfortunate to prepare cost estimates by technologies for I think it was Middlesex, New Jersey Water District in a legal case. And it's a mid-size, I'll call it a mid-size town or city. And the costs were something between, I want to say, 30 and $50 million. And this was at 70 parts per trillion, not 4 to 10. So the lower you go, the more expensive it gets because it gets harder and harder to take this stuff out. And so the comment that Mr. Chavez said, well, some of these systems, people are going to have to take PFAS out that's already there. And I was kind of incredulous about that. I thought, well, in what world does that justify adding more burden to them?
Yeah, I'm like, okay, so if one person is putting a little drop of arsenic in your well, by all means, let's let somebody else come in and put 20 drops because the other guy did one. I mean, these data centers, it's the magnitude is so much larger. Comparing them to pollutants from a gas station or a smaller, different type of operating facility. I mean, you're talking about comparing apples with oranges here on a serious issue, and when you're talking about recouping these costs later. So if we don't have Ohio be proactive, which I don't know why our legislature has a hard time being proactive, but they seem to. If they aren't proactive on this by requiring data centers, I think all of the ones that have already been previously operating, I think, as I mentioned in my testimony, if they don't require them to attach a water cleaning facility on site for the water they are going to discharge in the closed loop or whatever type of a loop system, that when that water has to come out, it's got to go somewhere. If they aren't cleaning that before they put it back in, that is an increased burden on the city water systems or lakes, rivers, and streams, wherever it ends up. And then who pays for that at the end? We do. And that's why I mentioned HB 126, which is currently in the Senate, because that bill removes liability for any public nuisance lawsuits. Well, if the state does not require the EPA to monitor PFAS and they allow them to continue putting it into the municipalities, and then later the municipalities are responsible to clean it up because the data centers aren't, those municipalities cannot sue for the upgrades required to clean this stuff out because they've got a million times more of it than they would have had in the water, okay, because it's a data center. They can't recoup those costs. Now, I find it fascinating that a bill like that happens to be moving through so quickly, this assembly. While this is going on, it's a little bit strange timing here, but that's why we've come out against that bill. I mean, like you said, the costs to those municipalities, and if something, this is like a township or something, can you even imagine the burden on a township who's having to clean up PFAS requirements when that comes down the pipeline? And they're sitting there with a data center right there, and they're dealing with all that. It's going to be catastrophic for the taxpayers.
I mean, these 3 points to be made, I guess, real quickly on what you've just said. One, these mega data centers could produce upwards of 10 million gallons of wastewater. And that could overwhelm some of these existing facilities. But the first thing that has to be done, I think, is that these municipalities, or not the municipalities, the data centers should have to put in continuous monitoring of the unregulated components immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Because without knowing what they are, how do we control
Exactly.
them? And if they're not regulated, they're not going to monitor them unless there's a forcing function. And then the reason that I pointed out the PFAS issue was to illustrate what you've just mentioned, which is this is not a surprise. Industry, where it can, because they're in the business of making money, nothing wrong with that, they're going to shift costs to the public where they can and where they can get away with it.
Yes.
I don't find that wrong necessarily. It's just the way it is. On the other hand, we have power, water, and wastewater costs that can be borne either by the public, by the data center, or some combination thereof. I don't think that's been well thought through. But taken to the extreme, those burdens could all be shifted to the public. Now, it was curious there was a point made yesterday about, well, EPA has only had to issue one permit to install, permit to operate out of the 190 or so plants.
Yeah, that was eye opening.
The elephant in the room, they didn't follow up by saying, oh, by the way, the other 189 or however many it was, the other 99.9% are dumping their wastewaters into public municipal wastewater treatment facilities. Now, the problem with that is, one, that cost is now being borne by those facilities. But more importantly, the unregulated chemicals are probably not even known to these facilities. So if you get an excess of a biocide, it could affect the bugs which chew up in the secondary treatment, could affect the plant negatively. So without this continuous monitoring and providing of this information to the wastewater treatment facilities, they don't know what they're getting hit with. And they're being hit by large volumes. But then you back up and you say, but who's really bearing the cost? They might say, well, we pay them a discharge fee. But what if the plant has to double in size? Or what if there are unforeseen improvements that need to be made to clean up these unregulated chemicals? Or there are costs associated with negative impacts on the operations of these facilities, like killing the bugs. So, it was a little disarming to sort of hear this, well, we've only had one permit, and then sort of dismissing the fact that most of these data centers are already taking advantage of the public's investments, the taxpayers' investments in municipal treatment plants. That's not being borne by and large by these data centers. And that
No, and
point,
exactly, and that's what the director of the EPA said, and this is what the committee members missed because this was a sleight of hand kind of a situation. He said data centers have not been identified as a source of PFAS either at the state or federal level. Identified doesn't mean they don't have it. They haven't been identified as having it. Well, how do you identify it? You have to disclose what's in it. You have to test it, and you have to say these chemicals have these harms, and we need to monitor it. But that isn't what he said. And so the committee members are nodding their heads going, oh, good, data centers don't have any PFAS in them. And that's not what he said at all. So again, that really bothered me that the director of the EPA, I mean, is it the correct language? Yeah, I mean, that's like lawyer language, I guess. No offense
yeah, it
to
was kind
lawyers.
of a sleight of hand, and you always
It
got to
was.
watch the words and the adjectives. I've learned that a lot being an expert witness.
Hmm.
And the literature is pretty clear that the data centers are likely, not in all cases, but they're likely to be discharging some PFASs. The point to be made here is I don't know that anybody's monitoring for them. So it's easy to say, well, we're not aware of any. Well, how are you going to be aware of it if you never look for it? I
Exactly.
mean, there's a good friend of mine who says you can never find what you don't measure. And it's so true. And so there was a little bit of sleight of hand there in that testimony. And the reality is, if you go and look, do some simple internet checks, there's clear evidence from the internet that it's more likely than not that there's going to be PFASs in some of these loops. The question is how much and what's the concentration. But unless we start monitoring for this and the other non-regulated chemicals, we'll never be in a position to make the right decisions.
Exactly.
We'll
And I
be
think
making a default decision that there's no problem here.
right, and then that gets deferred on to our children and our grandchildren because we didn't do our due diligence now. I
Even worse than
think
that, it gets deferred in the PFAS case. It's going to be a real cost in 2029 to 2031 when the municipalities on drinking water side have to clean it up.
yeah, and then that will be all on us. It won't be the data centers paying for that. I think a good starting point, and I think something that the study commission should study, is first off to contact every currently operating data center and get a full list of the chemicals that are used in the cooling systems. Period. And and that those chemicals are in fact in the discharge water, and that's a starting point.
Well,
First, the
I think they need, well, not only that, they need an inventory on what goes in the systems,
mhm.
but they also, sometimes the PFASs may they may be extracted or be a contaminant or be on, say, Teflon parts and be extracted in the process. So you really need a monitoring program
You're talking about,
for,
like, leaching for people to
yes,
understand, like, leaching that would leach
correct,
into the yeah.
correct. And so what you really need is you need a robust monitoring program for enough plants so that you can statistically show what the likelihood is of the amount and the concentrations of these chemicals from the various types of data centers and cooling loops that are in process. And to me, that's a starting point.
Now,
And
quick follow-up on that. That type of monitoring would not be a massive expense for these, data centers to put into play right now if they wanted to run some real-time data right now, contact, 30 of them and say, here's what we want you to monitor your chemical levels every day for whatever number of days, whatever what we'd probably ask you what that would be.
right.
And then we want that data back so we can assess what that looks like. Is it super expensive for them to do continuous monitoring? Is that like something that's going to be a huge financial burden? Because they'll always say, well, that's a burden to put on these companies. Well, they should have a burden, I think, even if there is a little bit one, because we're talking about water here.
I I mean, it always depends on how many samples you take and for how long. But I don't think relative to the amounts of resources being used to build, operate, and the revenues and profits coming from these facilities,
Yeah.
I don't think those costs, particularly when you compare them to the downstream costs that might be borne by the public,
Hmm.
especially with things like forever chemicals, I don't think those costs are that significant.
Yeah. It'd be worth whatever small amount of quote unquote burden on the data center to provide that information when we're talking about the health and future of our water and our children and our grandchildren. So
Once the programs are set up, technicians can collect the samples. They're sent to qualified labs for analysis, and then a professional has to analyze or collect the data into a database, and then somebody ultimately will collect all that information and form opinions about what it says. But the technicians are not super expensive, and the labs are not that terribly expensive either.
okay, good to know. Good to know because these are things we need to pass on to the legislative body because these are the kinds of things that they need to be looking at. Um, So I know we don't want to keep people too long. It's hard to keep your attention on some of this like, kind of complicated stuff like this. But do you have any closing comments as far as what you would maybe what you would actually say to the legislative body? Like, here's what the expectations we think should be. Obviously, we talked about having an attached water facility should be automatic because that's going to be an issue. And then you're talking about the continuous monitoring. Is there anything else that you would say? Uh, you know, these items could be put into play legislatively that would give us good protection and make sure there are no costs or harm passed on to Ohioans.
Yeah, that's a complicated question, but a couple things. I think on the water side, there should be a monitoring program right away, even with existing facilities, to see the volume and the concentrations of the unregulated contaminants. Um, and frankly, you might as well throw the regulated ones in while you're doing it to know what those are, like the metals. Um, and the that will set us well for procedures. We've only talked about the potential cost to the public for simply wastewater treatment, but there are similar issues for power in terms of the effect on the grid, and there are similar issues for um, the water itself, whether it be taken from public supplies or I'll call them shared resources, aquifers, and the same issues apply there with respect to what's a reasonable burden for the public to pay versus the company installing the facility.
Right.
And I think that the economics for all three of those categories have not been undertaken to know what are we giving up in the short term, what are we giving up
Hmm.
uh, for the long term. And I think there are real concerns that the public is going to really share downstream in a huge burden of cost. and simply because of the volumes of electricity, water, and wastewater involved. And then I would close by saying, I really think this issue is not a Republican or a Democratic issue. In fact, you saw it in the hearing. And I think the Republicans would be well um, advised to take a proactive approach here.
Hmm.
If not, I think it's going to bite them, you know where.
Yeah,
And I think there's nothing wrong with doing the right thing, and that doesn't mean you have to be completely nuts about every last issue on the environmental side, but it does mean you need to make some reasonable decisions that, by and large, protect the public's interests.
I agree. I agree 100%. And I know that you would be more than happy to work with the legislators forming this type of language, ensuring that they put forth. I know they're saying they're going to do some sort of a bill to address this, but to make sure that the provisions of that bill actually play out in the real world the way that we're talking about here, and that also that any legislation they do has penalties for violations. I mean, I think with all your experience in court, I think you would definitely say without penalties, without strict penalties for violations of these things, these companies are going to do what's in their best interest, not ours. Would you agree that any bill that they would put forward must have penalties to be effective in the real world?
I do, and one of the things, I'll tell you a true anecdote. One time, I was in a court case, and typically, what happens is the chief engineer or the chief medical officer knows is going on internally and just lets it go. Right? Doesn't tell the CEO, "Hey, we got a problem here," or doesn't take full responsibility because they know there's no criminal penalties to them personally. They can basically just retire, and the suits go on, and the shareholders pay for it eventually.
Mm-hmm.
And and so I remember an attorney told me that chief engineer and chief medical officer should go to jail. And I said, 100%. I said, but you wouldn't want that. And he says, what do you mean? I said, if you start putting chief medical officers and chief engineers in jail, you're not going to have these problems because these are conservative people and they're not going to fall on their sword if they're going to have a criminal penalty.
Yep.
And I've often thought that we could clean a lot of this up and spend a lot less money on litigation if there were criminal, if you pollute the water or that potentially harms 3,000 people, some of which will die,
Mm-hmm.
I think you should go to jail. I don't have any problem with that. And I said, when you start doing that, you watch industry. I mean, I'm all for industry, but the bad actors, you watch that clean up, it'll clean up really fast. So it's not just the monetary penalties, but I think it would be very novel as a Republican to start to say, whether it be the CEO or some position of power, if you damage or harm the community in a significant way, it's not going to be a fine that the shareholders pay and you get your retirement and continue to get your salary. You're going to go to jail. That that will really change the dynamics. It's something that I've thought about, having been involved in litigation now for 25 years. And I just think that, you know, if people don't do the right thing, then they need to pay a price.
Yeah, and I think accountability is very, very important. I'm very pro business, and but if the business isn't accountable to anyone, then I mean, if they can cause egregious harm and they're not accountable, we have a real problem. So I'm with you. I really hope that I want the Republicans to get this right. They're in charge. They've been in charge, and if they mishandle this issue with data centers, which is in the forefront of people, 70% of Americans, it's in the forefront of their mind right now. If Republicans mismanage this, I mean, to get political, we're looking at real tough times come November. And I don't even know how much further out than November that those effects could ripple. So if they're looking to have people be happy with them and want to keep them in power, they're going to have to do the right thing on this issue and ensure that citizens now and in the future for Ohio are taken care of, and that we are pro business and we want these guys to be able to do what they're doing, but we want them to do it right. And so I hope that they will do the right thing. But I appreciate you coming on and making this all clear to the public. And honestly, I think this is going to clear up a lot for the legislators themselves. I think this is going to be very, very beneficial for them. I know you did. We had to present to the Maha Caucus, which was amazing. We didn't have everybody on the call there, but as many legislators as possible need to see this information, and they need to really think about legislatively what they want to do and what direction they want Ohio to go in the area of data centers, because we could, in fact, set a standard to lead the nation, instead of just jumping in bed with these guys and just letting them go any which way they want. We could be the stand up state that does the right thing, and I hope that we will be that. So, thank you, Stephen, and I appreciate you. You're the best. I know you, you did a lot on the mask issue too. You've just been all around amazing, and we're so glad that we have you at least part time in Ohio, and that you're willing to help us out on stuff like this. So, thank you so much for all you do.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity, and thanks for all you do.
Thank you.
Take care.